right, welcome. We are ready to get started. We are almost finished with our Amazon Web Services talk about being a certified cloud practitioner. And so at this point, just to make sure everyone's caught up, if you need this GitHub resource, you can ! GitHub. That command will take you to this GitHub repository where I've been keeping this document and things up to date. Just a second, I gotta turn that music down. That's really loud in my ear. Okay. If you're watching this on YouTube, it should be down in the comment or in the description of the video where you can get a hold of this document. So these have kind of been living documents that I have been working on while making these videos and talking through each one of these things so that you would have the links and the notes and everything to kind of go along with this. So the Certified Cloud Practitioner has 4 domains. We've talked through this section on cloud concepts, which was really just like an introduction to if you don't know really anything about the cloud and how it works and why businesses would want to use the cloud. That's what that's for. Then we get into, we talked in the technology domain about all of the different methods of deploying and operating the cloud, the global infrastructure, and then we identified all of the core AWS services and talked about those and how they work and what you would do with those. We haven't talked about technology support. I figured that was probably the last thing I would tackle. We've talked a little bit about billing and pricing, but we need to kind of go through some of that. There's not a lot in Domain 4 when it comes to billing and pricing. We have talked a little bit about calculators and how to kind of measure your usage and free tier, but we haven't really added anything into that document. The big chunk that I want to tackle right now, we've talked about this shared responsibility model, which ties into global infrastructure, regions and availability, right? We talked about all that stuff. But we need to talk about security and compliance, especially if you're new to these concepts of like, what is compliance and how does it work and why does it matter when supporting a business and its operations, and like especially in industries where you have particular compliance rules that you have to follow. And I'm gonna apologize right now. I am gonna itch my nose like crazy. We're in the middle of that Sahara dust storm thing and it's killing my sinuses, and like I just want to like scratch my face all day, so I apologize. That's gonna look really weird, but we push on. So we're gonna talk about security and compliance today, which is kind of an AWS architecture core concept. So let me get into, let's see, we're gonna grab this and we're gonna get into our document. And we're gonna go down, this was cloud computing scenarios, okay. Cloud security and compliance. All right. Yes, okay. Level 4 heading, level 4 heading. Okay, just trying to make sure I've got my markup formatting nice. I don't want to do anything weird. All right, so security and compliance. Where do I want to start? You get my notes over here. So at this point, if you followed along with me thus far, we've covered concepts like understanding the cloud, understanding those core services, how you're going to be implementing many of those things within the cloud. And so now we need to talk about security and what is our responsibility when we're building a solution on AWS, either like for our own business, for an internal business, or for a client. Maybe you're doing this freelance. we need to understand, what does AWS provide out of the box for us? We also need to talk about concepts like architecture and understanding how we can build highly available and fault-tolerant applications. So once you get, because remember we've talked about how the Cloud Practitioner Certification, it's kind of a license to drive, right? You don't need one to actually use the platform, but it gets you enough knowledge that you can really start to get in and do some real applicable things. And so, understanding how to build highly available, fault-tolerant applications and have the information that you need to move on with your journey, be a certified cloud practitioner, and then maybe start really getting your hands dirty in here and thinking about this on a more professional level, and maybe even pursuing some of those professional level certifications. And so, let's begin with kind of security. I have some notes here on security and architecture. We've talked about that shared responsibility model. That's important. The acceptable use policy, we're going to talk about that. Okay. So just a recap on that shared responsibility model. Let's just put a note in here, like a small heading. Right, so the shared responsibility model, it's really important. Everyone who uses the platform should really understand what this means at kind of like the detailed level. And so Amazon kind of puts it like security and compliance is a shared responsibility between AWS and the customer. Since it's a shared responsibility, we have to have a good level of understanding of what is the responsibility of AWS and what is our responsibility to the customer. So at a high level, we can kind of put it this way. AWS has the responsibility to you could say AWS has the responsibility for the security of the cloud. And I laugh when I say that because you might be thinking, well, gosh, doesn't that just mean everything? Like, then I don't have any responsibility. Like, isn't the cloud the whole point? And you would be right, except we would say the customer is responsible for the security in the cloud, right? All right, so think of it this way, right? We've talked about AWS owns all the hardware, the data center. They're responsible for making sure that data center stays safe, that the hardware that they've installed is not compromised, that the people who work there have the appropriate level of access to the things housed in the data center, and then you're not going to have like a rogue actor who works for Amazon who has access to things they shouldn't have access to, or is able to install things in the data center they shouldn't be able to. The customer's responsibility is the security of the applications and things that they are actually putting in the cloud. So when we say AWS has the responsibility for the security of the cloud, then that means like core systems that are running the entire platform, whereas the customer has control over the things they are putting onto the platform and how they're using it. So that's what we mean by this shared responsibility model, and I'm going to say of security. Because you have to work together as a team to make sure that everything is running smoothly. So, you know, like I said, AWS has, you know, the entire platform, the access control and training for their employees, control of what employees can access, make sure they have the training to know what they need to do. Part of that is that AWS is responsible for these global data centers and that underlying network. So making sure that, you know, they're not going to have some kind of access issue, you know, that the data center is going to be able to continue to operate as it should. What else? The hardware, right? So they're responsible for the different availability zones, the regions, making sure that all the connectivity, making sure all data centers and availability zones maintain connectivity. Responsible for the hardware that allows for global infrastructure. So they're going to take care of, you know, the switches, the servers, they're going to be responsible for configuration management. So determining how bits of data get from one location to another, right? We can't control that. Amazon controls that. That's their responsibility. They also handle patching of the cloud infrastructure and services to make sure that everything's going to be, you know, on the up and up in terms of being patched and secured. So they're going to have control over those core servers, the bare metal, so to speak, that are actually running some of your virtual servers, and the servers that are running many of the services that you use on AWS. They're in charge of patching those to make sure that all of the cloud infrastructure works. So the customer, responsible for the security in the cloud, right? Control over the things they're putting on the platform and how they're using it. We could say the customer, we could say our responsibility, however you want to put it. So let's see. So it's our responsibility for individual access to cloud resources and training. So if we are allowing people into our AWS account, we're allowing people access to the API, we're making sure that they have the proper access and that they have the right training to be able to, you know, get into resources. We need to make sure that we give least privilege access to those people in our company that need to access cloud resources. We're responsible for training them to make sure that they know how to use those services that are available on AWS, and they're not going to go in there and make configuration changes or mistakes. Another key one that seems to be something that people miss is that the customer, you, us, is ultimately responsible for data security and encryption. Amazon gives us this great platform to install things and set up these services and access to this underlying infrastructure. But when it comes to in-transit data, so data going back and forth between different services or different locations, or data at rest, so that the data, it's actually stored somewhere, it's our responsibility to be sure that we're following best practices. So for example, let's say you choose to put unencrypted data in an S3 container. You have the ability to configure the service to store that data so it's encrypted at rest. And it's your responsibility to do so if that's the appropriate thing for that data. So in addition, we have operating systems, networks, firewall configuration, all of that's on us. So if you're using, we talked about these various models. If you're using these models and you're kind of doing this infrastructure as a service, and you're using, let's say, an EC2 virtual server, you're responsible for that operating system, including patching. If you're configuring your own virtual private cloud networks, you're responsible for that network configuration and things like your access control list and your security groups. You're also responsible for the code that you deploy onto the cloud infrastructure. So if you write a Lambda function that does something incorrectly, that's your responsibility. If you install software onto your EC2 server that is compromised, that's your problem, right? Not AWS's problem. So it's important to understand AWS cannot be fully responsible and own all of the code that you upload or things that you do on the platform. You're responsible for patching any guest operating systems, custom applications that you're leveraging. So it's important to note that here, that when you think of any solution that you're deploying on the cloud, that you clearly understand, what you're responsible for, what AWS is responsible for, and making sure that, especially as you prepare for this exam, it's important to look at the scenarios and understand who has the responsibility in those scenarios so that you can properly identify that. So hopefully that's clear. Let me go ahead and commit to update our document. Commit early, commit often. No lost I should have grabbed that link. I will update that. Okay. So that's about all we're going to talk about when it comes to kind of our shared responsibility model. Now we could talk about what's considered to be a well-architected framework because especially if you're new to AWS, it can be really challenging to know how to kind of best practice create solutions on the platform. And so over time, Amazon has kind of created this collected best practices that you should understand and review and make sure that you follow in those cases. And they put these together into a single resource called the AWS Well-Architected Framework. Spelling. And let's see, I'm gonna throw a link to it in here. I'm gonna grab the link. So, and here I'll show you what this looks like. So on this page, the well-architected framework, they have this, again, a collection of best practices organized across 5 key pillars to help you best create systems that drive business value. And so you can go through these different areas that they've identified, they call this the lens. So different ways that you can look at, like in the serverless, design, deploy, and architect your serverless application, design, deploy, and architect your high performance computing workloads. So it is definitely in your best interest to go through this and read and understand, what are they getting at, so that you can learn how the best practice way to do these things, should be created. Some of that's about, just operational excellence, making sure that we are running and monitoring our systems for the best business value. But we also want to talk about efficiency too, because remember, the cloud platform is all about kind of pay as you use. So making sure that we are using things in the most efficient way, both with the time it takes to build and deploy, but also the usage to make sure that we are getting our, kind of best bang for your buck. So how does that work into security? Well, they kind of go hand in hand. So you have to kind of think about these best practices when you're building and deploying your solutions to protect your information and your business assets. Not just to deploy them to the cloud, but how you monitor them to make sure that you are following standards of security throughout the life of those assets, thinking about reliability and that high availability, that fault tolerance that we've talked about earlier, how to make sure that you're taking advantage of those things, monitoring for those things. So I wanted to make sure we stuck that in there so that you knew it existed and can go through that site and review to make sure that you are, really thinking about those different pillars. And so those different pillars, let me stick this in here, focuses on I lost my thing. Okay. The 5 key pillars that help you know how to best create systems that drive business value. And those 5 key pillars are framework, which are things like design principles, kind of gives you, there's like a white paper you can go read But operational excellence, security, reliability, performance, efficiency, and cost optimization. Yep. All right. So, next we're going to talk about, there wasn't really anywhere, no, nowhere for me to link any of that. All right, we're going to talk about high availability and fault tolerance. Because these are our key important things that fall under our umbrella of security and compliance. They also fall under the reliability pillar of our well-architected framework, so that's just important to note. Really the key quote we could kind of say is our guiding star, our North Star, as we look at the concept of high availability and fault tolerance, comes from the CTO of Amazon, and he says that everything fails all the time. And that's kind of like the whole pillar behind how AWS works too, is, you know, making sure that you have that backup for fault tolerance, that you're going to be able to maintain that high availability. So as we start to build whatever you're building, you can, you know, think about that concept of everything is going to fail all the time, and, you know, make sure that we're building knowing that the failure can happen at any point in our architecture. So with reliability, and we talked a little bit about reliability when we went over you know, the different availability zones and how you can kind of make sure that you're prepared for those kinds of things. So fault tolerance, which basically means we're going to be able to support the failure of components within your architecture. So, you know, we looked at some services that help us do this, and we looked at what we can do kind of using a queue to help mitigate challenges that would exist if some of our processing power were actually to go offline, maybe downstream from that queue. We also have kind of this other concept of high availability. And so high availability means that we want to keep our entire solution up and running in its expected manner, despite any issues that may occur. So it's kind of a little bit of a tug of war. You've got this infrastructure, it's set up to do what it's supposed to do, serve your application, allow users to do what they need. You know something is going to fail. The idea of fault tolerance means that we're going to support the failure of components within our architecture with kind of a backup plan solution, redundancy, whatever, with this idea of high availability, which means the entire solution will stay up and running no matter what. So when you are looking at how to build solutions on AWS with these things in mind, you know, we think about most managed AWS services provide high availability right out of the box without us having to do a lot, which is great. It limits the amount of time that we have to build or think about this at all, right? So for example, let's say we're storing data using an S3 standard storage class. then we know that that data is going to be stored across multiple availability zones by default. We don't have to worry about building in any type of a backup system for our production. Our applications are going to be okay. They're going to have access to that data. It's baked into the service. However, on the flip side of that, when we're building solutions directly onto an EC2 server, for example, then fault tolerance is something you have to think about. Because what if something happens to that server? We have to figure out where to build that in. And this goes back to when we talked about different cloud deployment models. If we're going to look at solutions that are using that infrastructure as a service, then this is really where we have to kind of consider fault tolerance, because we're going to have to figure out how to build it into that solution and kind of make that a custom solution for us. And at minimum, we know that we need to integrate within multiple availability zones so that we can deal with the potential failure of a complete availability zone within a region. Like, God forbid, like a whole availability zone goes down, then what? Some services can enable fault tolerance in your custom applications, but you know, using something like the simple queue service, we could build a queue so that data and events can be processed, or they can be held until they're ready to be processed, making sure that we don't lose what we're trying to do while we're working on that fault tolerance in our application. That way, if anything downstream goes offline, we still have a functional application. In addition, you know, we talked about things like Route 53, so you can use Route 53 to detect if there are endpoints that are unhealthy and then route users to the right service that might be available. So kind of everything we do centers around these two ideas of making sure that our architecture is designed for fault tolerance and high availability. So I think we're ready to dig into compliance. I know some of you are super excited about talking about compliance because it's such an interesting and fascinating topic. How would you not want to talk about legal and bureaucratic BS? But compliance, depending on where you are within the technical world, this might or might not be a familiar concept to you. But let's talk about compliance at kind of a high level and some different compliance standards. So you might be familiar with something like PCI DSS, which is a standard for processing credit cards. If you've ever done any kind of credit card payment processing or merchanting, it's basically an agreement on how you're going to handle that data. And part of that agreement that you have with the credit card companies for being able to process those cards is that if you're dealing with the data directly, then you have to meet certain standards to make sure that you're not going to open customers up to, fraud and card skimmers and those kinds of things. You have to meet those standards. When you meet those standards, it means you're in compliance with PCI DSS, or you're in compliance with whatever standards you're trying to meet. All compliance really means is that you are following the rules and standards set out in an agreement about how you will access, use, transfer, or store information. So maybe you're more familiar with standards like HIPAA, HIPAA. Maybe you've heard about this at the doctor's office, or you've read about this in the news or something, especially if you're in the United States. HIPAA is a very talked about subject. these are compliance standards for healthcare data. So in terms of privacy, making sure that only certain people have access to certain pieces of data. You know, your healthcare provider can't go tweet about how you were at the doctor's office earlier and you had a bad rash or something, right? That would be a violation. You know, you see your ex-girlfriend suddenly at the doctor's office who's working as a receptionist, and she might have access to your medical file if she doesn't actually have a reason to review that information, or if she should maybe go and gossip about why you were at the doctor's office, right? That's a compliance violation. So making sure that you're following standards, again, access, use, transfer, or store information. There are technical standards on operational processes related to data centers. These are called SOC standards, SOC 1, 2, and 3. There are also some that are focused on things like government standards, like FedRAMP. These are standards about US government data handling. There are others around things like personally identifiable information, or PII. Maybe you've heard about ISO standards, right? There's a lot of them. And again, this is why I laugh a little bit, because, you know, people don't really particularly like compliance, because it does just mean reading a lot, keeping up with the changes, making sure that you're following the rules. A lot of times they come with pretty hefty fines and penalties if you're not following the rules. So there's quite a bit. There are all kinds of different compliance standards, and there are services on AWS that can help you know how to navigate compliance standards. So depending on your business or industry, there are many different compliance standards you may have to review and follow. And there are tools on AWS to help you know how to navigate these compliance standards. That's kind of like a sub-bullet. So let's look at, we're going to talk about three in particular. The first one we're going to talk about is AWS Config. And we talked a little bit about AWS Config earlier, but there are some conformance packs that are provided to help you with aspects of compliance. Conformance packs. We also have AWS Artifact. Artifact provides self-service access to AWS compliance reports. A lot of compliance is monitoring data, tracking, and reporting. And so having those reports available can be very handy. We also have AWS Guard Duty, which provides intelligent threat detection to help monitor and detect if there are scenarios that are happening which are unusual. And a lot of times with different compliance standards, you have to make sure that, you know, if you are, if data is compromised, if someone was to get on your network and access data, you usually have a very small window of time in which you have to report that kind of thing. And so you want to make sure that you know if using something like Guard Duty, you know, something is happening, it's unusual, it could, you know, ultimately lead you to being out of compliance. And you know, just making sure that you are monitoring and that you're doing the proper things can go a long way. I don't know if there's anything else in this section I want to talk about. I guess I could link in. I have been linking in to the different services as I talk about them. So let me grab the link to config. Oops. That is an amazing link, Amazon. What on earth? There really was a period at the end of that. I thought I was a typo. And then artifact. And guard duty. There's a lot of reporting on AWS. You know, it seems like we've talked about 4 or 5 different services that do all kinds of monitoring and reporting and things like that. So, all right, I think that's all we're gonna talk about for compliance. You know, you definitely want to look over this well-architected framework because there's just a ton more information here that, you know, we could go through and do some little lab scenarios with the framework. But they also have some different scenarios in there that you can review. I have some scenario questions for you, I think. Let's see. Do I? Oh geez, where did I put them? Let me go look at my folder. It's like... everything. The part of the reason I'm doing this is because all of my stuff is all spread out everywhere. I did not do a great job of making sure that things were organized. One moment while I dig around in a folder. I've got a lot of other stuff. I've got a lot of other stuff. Oh gosh, let me unzip this. Let's see. What is this? And here you thought that the time between... Oh, there's actually a couple of links I do want to stick in here. Aha. Alright, there was a couple other things about compliance and stuff that we do want to, I do want to make sure and stick in this document. So the first one is the AWS Acceptable Use Policy. Because you definitely don't want to be doing something on the platform that's not allowed and then like get your account banned or something. I'm sure your organization would be real pleased with you if you did that. There's also a really good link here on the shared responsibility model, so you can do some further reading on that, which is pretty great. I'm all about giving you as much resources as I can so that you are prepared. And then, yeah, we had the one for the well-architected framework because I had that one in here too. So good, 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 good. All right, where are my scenario questions? Grr. Ooh, I had some questions in here about the well-architected framework that are like fill in the blank. Let's put these in here too. So this was domain 2 cloud computing scenarios. Let's just add, yeah, okay. Let's add these in here. All right, so the first one, the first one I had was about the pillars of the well-architected framework. So it was like blank is the running. Ooh, the markup is like, what are you doing? Oh, it doesn't like this underlined. Let's do it like this. Running and monitoring systems for business value. I guess I could maybe reword these into a question. Let's see. Let's reword them into a question. Which of the pillars of the well-architected framework involves the running and monitoring of systems for business value? And that would be the operational excellence, I'm just going to grab the first part of this because we're going to reword all these into questions. The second one, protecting information and business assets, involves protecting information and business assets. And this is security. And then which one involves enabling infrastructure to recover from disruptions? And that is reliability. And then which one involves using resources efficiently to achieve business value. And that is performance efficiency. And then which one involves achieving minimal costs for the desired value? And that is cost optimization. So yeah, you definitely want to study those. They're on the test. That's why I gave you the link. All right, yeah, I do have a couple of scenarios. Let's add these to the end down here. All right, so for our scenario, so we have company A, which is building an application to process credit cards. They will be processing cards directly and not through a service. And they don't mean like an AWS service, they mean like a credit card processing service. Their bank needs a PCI DSS compliance report from AWS. Where would they go to get this information? All right, so hopefully we remember that the AWS artifact service that I talked about is the one that will get you compliance reports. All right, next one. All right, company B is considering a transition to the cloud, and they store personal information securely in their system. The CTO has asked what is the company's responsibility for security of this data. What would you tell the CTO? Well, you tell him a lot of things about what we've learned about AWS's responsibility versus the company's responsibility for the security of the data. You would want to any compliance rules for your industry or business regarding personal information storage. You would review the AWS shared responsibility model to make sure that you give a very thorough and clear and comprehensive answer to this question. Because depending on your organization and your compliance rules about personal information storage and how you need to keep that secure, you know, that's going to be all laid out for you. But then you can talk about, you know, what we originally discussed about the shared responsibility model of what is AWS going to take care of for you versus what are you going to have to take care of depending on how your organization is storing data, what services you're using, how customized your setup is. All right, so our third scenario here, company C is building a new tool for digital asset management. And they are curious how to best leverage the capabilities of AWS in their application. So what resources, oh geez. Would you recommend to them? So anytime that you see questions about architecture, right? They're building a new tool for digital asset management. They don't know what they need. They don't know what services they need. They're curious about how to leverage the capabilities of the platform. These kinds of questions are almost always like, review the AWS well-architected framework. Like that's the answer. You know, review the framework, talk to them about what they need, what kind of data they're storing, how does it work. That's the answer. All right, so let's commit. That's basically the end of our, I need to grab this link, section on security and compliance. Let's grab this link. There's a lot I didn't talk about just because you really need to go review the documents. Go review the acceptable use policy. You know, depending on what your organization is doing, you know, it may not be something you can actually do on AWS. So you don't want to plan a migration to the cloud only to find out that you're going to be doing something prohibited by the acceptable use policy. And you can go through here and kind of see, you know, what's basically not allowed. You know, you can't do some of these different things. You can't spam people, right? You'll want to review this shared responsibility model section. It's a very nice infographic on here about, you know, what is AWS's responsibility versus what is the customer's responsibility. Some different talking points so that if you do find yourself in that situation having to give a report to a CTO or something like that, or you're making the argument for moving to the cloud, then sometimes that gives you some good information to use. But we kind of broke that down on our own, as well as went over this well-architected framework and the 5 pillars. There's also, yeah, this well-architected tool. I don't know if we can, yeah, I have to go log into it. But you can actually kind of like go through and talk about services and things, and then it'll give you some recommendations. But yeah, you can, you know, read the different white papers, go through some of these scenarios, understand kind of all the things that are available to you in there. And then really kind of just understanding, you know, these ideas of high availability and fault tolerance, compliance, you know, what it is, why we have to understand it, why we have to use it. And then these 3 services that we talked about here that are specifically for that. So this is a good stopping place for us. I think next we're going to talk about this access management. We'll get into AWS identities and user management and IAM controls and things like that. And then we're going to start talking about support, security support and platform support. But I know this one's a little shorter than usual. Again, my sinuses are killing me with this dust storm, and I'm just like super fidgety and itchy, but I wanted to get this out to you because I know it's been a little while. Things for me right now are kind of hectic, but I am still committed to helping you get through your Cloud Practitioner studies. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Again, if you need the doc, you can grab that link down in the bottom section on my GitHub, in that AWS resources repository. But again, I'm open to questions. So if you have questions, you can leave them in the comments. add me on Discord. Feel free to reach out if you do have questions on resources or anything. I'm happy to, help hook you up with some reading material or study tools and things like that if you're working on your AWS certifications. So this is the end of what I'm doing here. I think I'm going to play some games. I don't know if I'm going to do those on stream, but I am going to take a little BRB real quick to kind of move on from here. So thanks for sticking around for the AWS stuff. I will catch you later.